Welcome, and so pleased to see so many of you here. It is warm, we will get through it. There's lots of breeze coming through, I think. So two fantastically talented authors, and I'm just so pleased to be chatting to them both again. We've spoken, all of us, in the past, so it's wonderful to be reunited in this way. A little bit about them, I'm sure you know, but Anuradha's been long-listed for the Man Booker Prize. She's won many other awards, including the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. From her debut, which was picked as one of the Washington Times Best Book of the Year, to her latest novel, All the Lives We Never Lived, and that's what we'll be talking about today, she has an incredibly luminous prose, and it reaches out to the world from her base in rural India. It enlightens us all, and it points to the differences between how we imagine ourselves and how others see us. She's also the co-founder of the publishing house Permanent Black, and we'll be talking about that a little bit too. Preti Taneja was born in the UK to Indian parents. She studied theology, she trained in journalism, she's worked with disadvantaged young people across the UK for a charity. She's been a reporter and an activist on minority rights worldwide, and she teaches writing and human rights at Warwick University and has an honorary fellowship at Jesus College in Cambridge. We That Are Young, which is her debut, huge book in every sense of the word, physically, but really in content, extraordinary. It was Book of the Year for the Sunday Times, The Hindu, Media Diversified, The Spectator, and The Guardian, and I'm sure many more to come as well. So thank you both for being here. So before we start discussing the themes and the issues that these brilliant works bring up, I thought we might talk about how you actually got to that point, because I know for you, publication was a really long road.
Yeah, there were a few false starts with this book. It was finished as part of a PhD in creative writing when I took a career change from my human rights work reporting on minority rights worldwide, because like many of us, I've always wanted to be a writer. So I decided to give myself that space and apply for a PhD and write this novel. And at the end of that process, it went out on submission with a super agent. This was 2013. And the responses in UK publishing were very complimentary, it was ambitious, it was all sorts of compliments, and then a big fat no from across the board, and in India as well. So I put it in a drawer, and I had to get on with finding a job in academia and beginning to consolidate my research into some kind of career, because I had done this career change. When I first told my father, for example, I wanted to go back to school after a career in journalism and human rights reporting, he sort of looked at me hopefully and he said, "Oh, you're going to do the MBA now?" I was like, "No, creative writing." And the poor guy nearly fell over, fell off the pavement. So I really had to make a go of it in academia. And then, but the rejections are difficult to take, I'm not going to lie about that. I found it very difficult to understand why a book that took Shakespeare and set it in contemporary India at a time that was so much to do with generational change, so many different things were going on. There was a real conversation to be had about the impact of empire on that moment of rising nationalism and so on, wasn't finding publication. So I kept going with the edits, and one day I saw on Twitter a competition advertised for novellas by a volunteer press based in Norwich. And I entered that because I had a story that fit that criteria, and the prize was being published, and it was a very, very small book called Kumkum Malhotra. They published it, and the publisher of that asked me, "Do you have anything else?" And I was sort of like, "Oh, my novel, it's awful." I gave him the chapter from which I'm going to read later, and he loved it. So he took it round to Gallybeggar Press. Norwich is quite a small publishing place. He took it round to their house, knocked on the door with my pages, and said, "I've got this writer, you've got to read this." He stood in their living room, which is much smaller than this tent. It's probably about the size of this stage, actually, until they had read sort of the first 50 pages, and they bought it. On the basis of that, and it was published in 2016. 2016 they bought it, 2017 it came out, and it basically is two people working from a home in Norwich who took a punt on a debut that's very, very different to what the normal diaspora debut is.
Absolutely. And your debut actually had a quite a long story too, didn't it?
I suppose it's difficult for first books. I mean, you can't blame the people you're sending it to because they don't know who you are. Very often I have a sense that they don't read what you've sent, because I had finished writing my book, and then I thought, because I had this other life as a publisher, I thought the publication of it would be just a breeze. Next week I'd have a contract. So with this optimism, I launched into sending it out to various people, both in India and in the West. And either I would not hear back from them at all, or it would be a rejection. And that went on for 16 rejections over a year and a half. Until, you open that email and you say, oh, we love it, but, and you reach the but and you feel your heart kind of plummeting to your feet. And then in 2007, I came to London for a publishing conference. And there were 6 or 7 speakers at the talk the series of talks I was attending. And the first 6 speakers talked only about product placement and bottom line. And the last speaker talked about books. He talked about how do you build a list, because he was speaking to us as publishers, as young publishers. So he talked about who do you want around your table who can speak to each other, and that is your list, because these are people who can live together in a list. So at the end of it, I plucked up courage, and although you never go to a publisher minus an agent, I went and told him that I have this book and it has no publisher, and every single agent has turned it down. And this was Christopher MacLehose, who used to be at Harville and had just then started a very small independent press, also then running out of his house. They had only published 2 books until then. And he read my first 50 pages at the fair. And at the end of it, he told me, I want to read the rest. And then he signed it on. And mine was the 4th book his press published. And since then, it's become a very big press, and he's published all my books. But the first one happened in this kind of lucky way as just yours.
And since then, you've become a very big writer too. I mean, we all look forward to your next book, and you usually plan it before you even finish the last one, don't you?
Well, this time it's another story.
And both of these books have quotes in their title, and so All the Lives We Never Lived is actually a kind of a bringing together of 2 bits of a quote, isn't it?
No, it's actually, there's one word inverted in this quote. This is a poem by a poet called Charles Elton, written long ago. It's called The Garden Song. And the poem was quoted by Virginia Woolf in To the Lighthouse, which is where I read it first. And in that quote, the line from the poem that I've used is all the lives we ever lived. And I changed it around because I wanted the whole emphasis of that line to become ironical and to talk about loss, in a sense, missed chances and missed lives, in a sense. So that was how the line was used.
And yours is obviously from Shakespeare.
Yes, We That Are Young is the last few lines of Shakespeare's King Lear, and it was very resonant because the book is told from the perspective of these 5 voices, these 5 young people who are taken from the play. And, we have this huge demographic of young people that's growing and growing and growing in India. So the idea that we that are young shall never see so much nor live so long kind of acts as a warning and also an excuse in some ways. And I really wanted to capture that ambivalence in the book.
Well, I think it's time we got a sense of the books, and so Anuradha, maybe just set it up for us, and then give us a reading. Whoops! So it's so big it makes a huge sound. Glad my foot wasn't.
Can kill people.
Yeah. All the Lives We Ever Lived has a boy called Mishkin in it. We encounter him first as an old man. He's in his late 60s. And he is trying to make sense through the book of the reasons why his mother left their home and went away to Bali when he was just 7 years old. And he's felt this profound sense of abandonment, which he's trying to grapple with. What brings about his effort to remember is that a package has arrived which he thinks contains something from his mother, which may alter the sense he has of his past. The book is very much about the fluidity of the past, about the ways in which history can be shaped and reshaped endlessly and can keep changing as time passes. So before he finds out what his mother has sent, or a voice from the grave kind of thing, he feels the need to write down what he himself remembers, to fix on paper his own sense of his own history. And this bit that I'm going to read you is where he asks himself what this kind of writing will entail. In telling the story of any life, and certainly when telling our own, we cannot pretend we are narrating everything just as it happened. Our memories come to us as images, feelings, glimpses, sometimes fleshed out, sometimes in outline. Time solidifies as well as dissolves. We have no precise recollection of how long things took. A few days, weeks, a month. Chunks of time are a blank, while others grow to be momentous in retrospect. I believe this is true of most people. Over the years, when friends contradicted me over details, my uncertain hold over my memories began to make me think I would no longer recognize myself in old photographs. The person in those black and white images was somebody else. Think too hard, and you might think yourself into lunacy. In one of his poems, Rabindranath Tagore says, I cannot remember my mother, but in the early autumn morning, the fragrance of the shiuli floats in the air. The scent of the morning prayers in the temple comes to me as a scent of my mother. The poet lost his mother when he was 14. I was only 9 the year my mother left. How can it be then that she is as close to me as my own reflection in the mirror, present in every detail, and yet imprisoned in a different element, unreachable? Entire conversations come back to me, incidents, arguments, the way she would line her eyes with kajal, the fresh flowers in her hair, the circle of red kumkum on her forehead, which was invariably smudged by mid-afternoon. How she recited rhymes to make me memorize them, how her skin was the color of beaten gold and her eyes slanted, how those slanted eyes had an impish gleam. I am certain I truly remember these things and have not built impressions up from stories and photographs. Yet the older I grow, the less certain I am of certainty.
Thank you, that was lovely. So that passage deals with memory and how we remember things. And of course, as well as the fictionalized memories, you have a lot of history in there, and you expertly blend the two. Yeah. And I'm particularly interested in a couple of characters that you have who are real, Walter and Beryl.
Yeah. One of the main characters in the book is Walter, who's Walter Spies. Walter Spies was a German artist in the 1920s, and he had an extraordinary life because he was born in Russia, and he was put into an internment camp when he was in his late teens or early 20s. And at that time, the most incredible thing about Walter Spies was that although he died at 47, because in fact India had come to him earlier, because when Tagore went in 1927 to Indonesia and to Bali, Walter Spies was his guide there. And when I discovered this connection, I felt as if all kinds of little networks were connecting my world to Spies' world, and that I needed to have him in my book as a character.
And at such an important kind of political time. Yeah. Your story too, Preti, is obviously based on an old story, albeit a fictional one. Tell us why Lear?
Well, the plot parallels between the history and sort of ideas of India as a nation are very easy to map from King Lear. So we start off with a partition of a kingdom, we end up with a civil war. And that for me was just from a very, very early age. I did Shakespeare at school, like many of us, for A-levels. King Lear was the set text on that. But for the first time, I was actually hearing in the classroom something that I was hearing about at home. It was about partition to me. And inside that love test is a very clear example of divide and rule, in which women are set against each other to compete for economic safety in form of dowry. And for me, that was just completely resonant. And those ideas just stayed with me for a very long time until I said I had to set my money where my mouth was and do this novel. And there they were, just, what am I going to write? I think I'm going to finally try and take this idea that King Lear can be mapped onto India and see where I can go with it. So it was very much a question of bringing together the education that I had as a young British Asian and the stories I was hearing about and the world I had seen when I was going back to India, to my parents' homeland.
Would you set it up and read for us, please?
Sure. We touched a little bit on the politics, and I'm going to read a section from the novel, which is probably the dark heart of the book. And it's taken from the storm scene in the book, in the play, in which one of the characters has escaped his very, very wealthy world, and he is taking disguise as a very poor beggar in a slum. It's just after a storm has passed, and he is having a kind of crazed vision. So it's a very sunny day, it's hot in here, but we're going to enter the darkness. I cannot survive on nothing. No one can. However much I try, I want. Jeet begins to sob. Bapuji rocks him gently. Shh, shh, be a good boy, Jeet thinks to himself in the basti. Say nothing, chup chup. Let the rain come again. Let it wash all of life away. Rain falls in a light sheen over everything. It drips through the holes in Jeet's plastic roof. It washes his face as he tries to look up. He sees Bapuji so clearly, every line on his face, every pigment mark. The man he has worshipped all of his life is really there, looking at him with pity. Jeet thinks he says, "Tat tvam asi," but he cannot be sure. Then fever takes over. Jeet remembers little after that, until night comes, the second after the storm, and Bapuji is in some new sort of frenzy. He tears at his filthy kurta, his diamond studs fall off. Jeet scrabbles for them, but Bapuji kicks them into the sewer. He rents at his shawl. He drops it in the mud. Legs tremble, arms ache, but Rudra raises himself up and falls on it. He wraps it between his legs and around his hips. Nanu wakes up from her corner, a bundle of torn chiffon and sodden papier-mâché skin, as if she is waiting to be formed. She tries to stop him, calling to Bapuji not to allow a madman to wear his clothes, not to turn the world ulta sida upar niche, risk each becoming the other. He feels Nanu's hands grab at him and slap him. His limbs twist with fever. He retreats to a corner, stroking his new covering, nursing himself. We that believe in India shining, he whispers it into his shawl. We that believe we are better than all others. We that are the youngest, the fastest, the democracy, the economy, the future technology of the world, the global superpower coming soon to a cinema near you. We, Hampanch, that are the 5 cousins of the 5 great rivers, everybody our brother, sister, lover. We that are divine, the echo of the ancient heroes of the old times. We that fight, we that love, we that are hungry, so hungry, we that are young. We that are jigging on the brink of ruin. We that are washed in the filth of corruption, chal so what, aise hota hai. We that are force of all that is natural, slow, death to gaze, chi-chi women in their skin tights high. We that sit picnicking on the edge of our crumbling civilization. We that party with shots and more shots as the world burns beneath us, as the dogs bark, as the cockroaches crow, as the old eat their young and the young whip their elders, all wearing the birth masks of respect. We that present only the shadows of ourselves behind our painted smiles. We that protest for the right to drink whiskey sours served to our beds at noon. We that eat our beef with chopsticks. We that twist tongues to suit our dear selves. We that worship the ancient religion of Lakshmi, of Shiva, of wealth creation and ultimate destruction. We that will be born strong in the next life and in a party that never ends. We that are the future of this planet. We that begin with this beloved India will endure. Yes, it all belongs to us and we will eat it all. We that are India, no longer slaves. We that are young. Who do you think you are, says Nanu. Where? This is the world where pundits take bribes for blessings. Do not shiver. When thieves don't come to the market, when Gandhus and Hijras get married in Krishna Mandirs, then Hamare Apne India will shine, hey? Somewhere it rains every day, whether you feel it in your palace or not.
Thank you. So your version of Lear basically is set, it's within this huge kind of corporation and the family that runs that corporation.
Yeah. Company, because Shakespeare's language allows us to see the artifice of the world, and I really wanted to capture that sense that we always understand through the form of the words that this is a world that's being constructed as a mirage to seduce us into a kind of consumerism and a kind of capitalism. It's a very hungry kind of capitalism, and these are very wealthy families that don't just have money and they have one kind of business, but they literally have fingers in every pie, from your oil that is taken out of the North Sea to the final store that's selling a polyester suit, which a man then wears to sell you something that is also made of some kind of plastic. So there's a sense of being trapped inside that neo-capitalist, neo-colonial type of movement there.
Shakespeare speaks to so many of the common themes, I think, and not only just in India, but worldwide. Your book picks up on this, particularly the rise of nationalism. And we see that in both works. I wanted to explore the differing ideas of Gandhian and Tagorean nationalism. You mentioned Tagore in your work, and how that feeds into your narrative.
Well, the central opposition in the book, in terms of the characters, is between the woman who goes away to Bali, whose name is Gayatri, and her husband, who is Nek Chand. And Nek Chand is considerably older than Gayatri and is a freedom fighter. He is a Gandhian freedom fighter who has a huge and generalized sense of compassion and empathy for the world at large, for the poor. He fights against injustice of all kinds, and yet the power struggle outside, in which he is on the side of the weak, is completely turned on its head inside his home, where he sees his wife's devotion to art, to dance, all of this as either irrelevant or just plain pointless in a time of political crisis. So the question the novel asks is one that Gandhi and Tagore actually debated at length in their letters to each other in that time in the 30s in India, where to simplify it a great deal, Gandhi was arguing with Tagore, saying that during the fight against imperialism, against British rule, first of all, that poets should not talk too much, because what did they know about politics? Secondly, that you needed to put aside things like wanting to know about Western civilization and literature, wanting to write or paint or make art, and every individual human being in India had to devote himself to the nationalist cause until freedom was won, and then you could come back to. But Tagore wrote a series of passionate articles against this, saying that the rational and high exercise of your mind was as important as anything, and that humanity was as important as patriotism, and that the kind of nationalism that was being demanded of people could very easily descend into the kind of parochialism, xenophobia, and hatred that we have seen, societies turning into now all over the world, kind of right-wing, violent societies. So he was seeing far into the future. And Gayatri, it is not as though she expresses these things, but instinctively she questions throughout the book, what is your version of freedom and is it my version of freedom? Because what will your freedom give to me? Will I be free to go camp under a tent in the mountainside and paint to my heart's content and dance in the garden? That's what I want to do, and what I want to do is as important as what you want to do. So these are the competing ideas of freedom.
And of course, what Lear's youngest daughter wants to do is to be free too.
Yes, I think Cordelia, Lear's youngest daughter, who is referenced as Sita in my book with that same kind of epic mythology around that name. She's an eco-warrior. She has a sort of extreme privilege, but she really wants to use it to undermine the corporation mentality that's sort of taking over and dividing people. So she doesn't, it's based on Lear, everyone dies at the end. I don't think I'm ruining it for you if I say that. But, this kind of rising nationalism that you're talking about that polarizes people, it's devastating to be in the second generation of British Asians to watch that happening, especially, when you've had parents who were born here who are re-experiencing that again, and when they look at what is happening in India, where we all still have family, we all still have friends, and we still feel very connected in different ways, and really to try to write that in a period of time of 5 years, of the last 5 years, against real events. They seem to be taking over even my imagination, and other writers have said this too. The stories that I've heard you tell as well. Just you cannot believe the kind of levels of soft power that are driving people apart in education curriculums in universities and freedom of press, journalistic life safety, and so on. So those are the kinds of terrors that echo through Lear in that time, and I was able to bring to bear very much on the world of contemporary India that I was writing itself into my book.
But if I can
Carry on. Yeah.
No, I was quite struck when I started out with this book. I didn't plan on, because I never start out with themes and plans, but mainly with the characters. But I hadn't thought that this world I would construct, which was so long ago, would find so many parallels in the present. And as I wrote it, it became clearer and clearer to me that this feeling I was getting was it was not exactly déjà vu, but the sense that these things had happened, and these things were happening again in an altered and terrifying form. It was as if that whole time had become real again, when you thought that surely something so ghastly as Nazism could not happen again. But you feel that what led to the point where someone like Walter Spies is being drowned in a ship for running away from the very country which he rejected for its politics. We are not that far from it.
No, and the sense of the present is very much in your work of modern day politics. But I love the way that you come at it obliquely. There's no kind of bashing it on the head, so to speak. Yeah. And with you, Preti, you've written about how form is really important, and how actually politics isn't this big thing. It's embedded in every sentence.
In the book, I think that's true. The form for me is such a kind of important part of the politics, because the way I choose to write, the tense I choose, the different voices all competing with each other, and each of these 5 young people are very, very different to each other, and they all have different political views. Jeet, the character that I wrote and I spoke about earlier, is a young gay man, and it's a very... My voice kind of catches when I talk about him, because he really lived in my world. I have quite close connections with activists and people who are gay in India. And when I was writing this book in 2012 in India, it was not illegal to be homosexual. And that was reversed after the current Prime Minister came to power. So this book has these moments of kind of flashes of utopia which then got completely reversed. And it's Jeet actually himself who is the most right-wing, and he's got this Hindu mythology and this driving force of toxic masculinity and nationalism that runs through his personality. He's a very, very torn character. So there's a lot of moments where you just think, I wished it could have been different. But this is the world that we have, and I think it's on us as fiction writers to try to say that somehow.
The family at the heart of your book is extremely wealthy, as we know, and we all know how deeply that appears to matter, not only in the time frame in which your book is set, but now, I would say. Mishkin himself has downgraded his own class, and I think that class is something that comes up again and again in your book too. But tell me about that he's gone from high to low, essentially, by choice.
Well, he's chosen a profession which his father finds contemptible, which is to be a gardener. He calls himself a glorified gardener. And he says, where other people take up pens and swords, I've picked up a trowel. And this his father finds appalling. His father thinks that at the time when Mishkin is getting into the working world, India has just become independent. There are so many urgent, apparently important political things to do, nation build, etc. But and why are you growing dahlias is what he asks his son at a time like this. But he has consciously done that. And in a sense, it's his response to a world where he has seen what all this can do to his own family, the public life. So he has, in the personal world, he's retreated himself into a world where he has this very strong connection to trees, because throughout his childhood, he's felt that everything else was fluid. His mother went away, his father left him for a short time. There seemed to be nothing fixed except the trees around him. And he senses that this is what he needs to hold into, and that the roots of the trees which grow underground go towards each other in completely unknown ways and intertwine in ways that people can't see. And this gives him great comfort, the thought of underground, subterranean connections. I'm not very good at analyzing my own work because, I really think of writing as, it's as if you're making a clock. You have one of those old clocks where you put in this and you put in that. You put in everything over many, many days, and at some point that clock starts to whir and tick, and it's all moving together as a world, and then you close up that clock, and that's that. If you were to ask me, take that clock apart, tell me how you did exactly this, why you did that, that's the part where I feel like, someone scholarly can read it, analyze it. I feel too close to it still to be able to really talk about it in a distant way. Like you said, your voice catches. Often when I think of Mishkin and his trees, I just feel like, how do I analyze this?
Your clock, to use that simile, is made up of several different parts. And what I find so interesting in your writing is that easy way you slip between language. And I just wondered, as a second-generation British Asian writer, what you're actually thinking in. Are you thinking in Hindu? Are you thinking in English? And who are you writing it for? Because you're not explaining it. I love that you're not. There must be a decision at some point that you don't have to go into explaining the small bits of Asian culture that a non-Asian reader might not know.
Yeah, I grew up in this world in which I was reading books by Indian writers writing in English because I was excited to know and learn about my parents' homeland, and it was exciting to see those names being published and finding those voices that spoke to my reality in some far removed way. And then I get to a point where someone's writing, oh, she was wearing her salwar kameez in italics or something, and I'm wearing my salwar kameez, and it's not something I think of in italics. So that stopped me, and it pulls me into a place where I'm thinking, wait, this book isn't actually for me. Even though I think it should be for me, it isn't, because it's explaining things that are part of my daily reality. My parents spoke in Hindi and Punjabi at home. My mother she died when I was 28. She was, she had extraordinary skills as a singer. She pankaj das ran through our home non-stop, she cooked, she was a chef of Indian cookery, and so these were not things that seemed strange or needed explaining. When I came to write my own novel, luckily for me, I had been released by this long string of rejections, and I just thought, I'm going to do whatever I want here. I'm going to write the book I wish that I could have read when I was younger. And it's extraordinary because some people come to me and say, I don't understand half the language in the book. Some of it's Hindi, some of it's Punjabi, some of it's Sanskrit, some of it's made up from a state that I made up called Nepanthala. But I love that because it makes me feel immersed in this world as if I am there. And these are all Indian characters speaking to each other, and they are completely bilingual, so they don't need to explain a chai or a roti or a, jal or a whatever it is. They just are talking to each other, and it's very important to me to have that immersion. But on the other hand, I have had people saying, Western readers won't enjoy this, they won't understand it, which I think is very snobby towards Western readers, to think that people don't just take you as you find you when you read. Why wouldn't we all do that? That's the kind of readers, that's what happens in the imagination. And also, I'm a Western reader. My sister's a Western reader, my dad's a Western reader, we are Western readers because nationality, boundaries, all of those things, I don't think reading takes any notice of that whatsoever.
What do you think about, because you're based in India,
Yeah.
You're writing in English. Do you think that your books are received differently depending on where they're written, where they're read?
No, I completely agree with you, by the way, that I've had to resist very, in the first book, I think some of the publishers put in a glossary abroad, but I've resisted that ever since, even abroad. But in India, the books have never had a glossary, and in India, there are 22 languages spoken. So when I use words in Bengali or any other language, there are people in other parts of the country who won't get it. But I don't think people read books in that way, as you say. There are so many. I would always ask publishers who were insisting on glossaries that we had to grow up reading books which had any number of Italian, French, and German phrases, words, lines, verses. Nothing was ever translated for us. We were expected to either know those languages or jolly well find out what those meant. And I think if a reader has a problem, they need to make an effort. And Google now, it's so easy. I mean, there are dictionaries online.
There's bits in the book where I try to reverse some of that in the text itself. There's a moment where one of the characters is looking at a picture of her Indian ancestor who was painted in an oil portrait as a Maharaja, but also in a kind of shooting lodge kind of way. And he's resting his foot on a pheasant, and she says to herself, a dead English bird. And she explains to herself what a pheasant is, because she's just not from the world that would know pheasants. And it's similar to learning Wordsworth in a school somewhere in the middle of empire and having to think about fields of daffodils. It's a very famous example of growing up in, I think it's in Kenya, where they're thinking, fields of daffodils? Wait, what? What is this? It's like yellow flowers growing in so these things that we take for granted from the places of our own lands, we need to learn how to trust our own realities as valid, and that is, I think, is what we're trying to get to here with language.
There's so much I want to ask you, and we're running out of time, and so I think that I'm going to skip ahead now and talk about women and violence against women. I think that it would be hugely remiss of us not to address that. Obviously it comes up in the books, but also just in the context of modern India. I was in a talk yesterday with Shashi Tharoor, who was talking about Hinduism. Apart from making me want to instantly convert, he was stressing how tolerant and inclusive it is, how many of the gods are women and so on. It made me wonder then, why is there such endemic sexual violence in India?
I think Indians prefer their women to be gods in the religious world and nothing in the real world, Hindu Indians. I don't know of any other religion which oppresses women in the way Hinduism does and always has. And the extreme patriarchy of India has now reached a point where nationalism meets patriarchy in a combination so nuclearly toxic that women are having the hardest time ever now in recent years. The violence against them is absolutely horrifying most of the time. And yet we go on saying in Hinduism women are worshipped, and in Hinduism, I was quite surprised that Hinduism is made out to be such a tolerant religion. I don't think it is a tolerant religion at all.
Preti, do you think that this is about erotic gratification, or is it about, as you said earlier, a kind of macho nationalism?
I feel like using sacred texts and interpreting them in a way which only corroborates your own fascist ideology is against every kind of religion, to be honest, and any kind of humanity. So let's think about caste and think about concepts of honour and shame, which are just so deeply ingrained and like put on the body to say, do your button up, or don't go out, or after dark, or the streets aren't yours.
Tie your hair.
Tie your hair, or,
Yeah.
you know, it's extraordinarily policing. I'm losing sight of your question a bit.
Well, and also, I mean, I think because I know you've written about this in the past, it also comes down quite a lot to, there's a lot of intergenerational trauma involved in how women are now and how it's come through this awful kind of seeping violence.
Maybe it's just being reported more, but I don't, and it's becoming more and more extreme and state sanctioned. As much as people rally against this kind of violence, someone else is going to come back even harder on you. Women's bodies, even from the time of partition, were used as sort of battlegrounds and sites for honour killing, as they call it. There's no honour in killing. When you're so inside a culture that you would actually take your own life to avoid being taken by men of the other side, or your own male relatives will put you to death so they don't have to bear the shame that you were taken by a man from another culture or religion. That's an extreme kind of linking of body to nation, and it goes back right into the depths of the sacred texts, which are now being used to justify that kind of violence.
With the whole Me Too movement, hashtag Me Too, really out there in the Western world, it seems to me that's you've gone so far beyond that in India. That's not even a relevant hashtag.
It's not irrelevant, because the Me Too movement in the West was also very much about abuse of power and institutions and so on. And that did play out in India a little bit. But the models of, the power structures are so strong that in the universities, when these things are reported, I'm not sure how much actually happened to reverse or punish or bring to justice it was all very random. It wasn't as widespread a response as it was here, in terms of taking down, exposing, bringing out into the open people who had abused power. But it's just that so much happens that is so very violent. Me Too doesn't begin to get it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Do you think that as a fiction writer, can any fiction begin to change that?
Yeah, I do. I honestly do, because many of my readers who I've met so far in this journey of my debut year have been young women who are just so glad to see that violence is being put into novels that are being sold in mainstream bookshops, and people are beginning to understand that, So when I think, you have two choices of fiction writer. You can either do something which is being called in the UK market as uplit, or you can do something which my book's being called, which is up yours lit, which I'm quite happy about. And I think it's really empowering. You know, of course, it's based on this epic play, but that really brings together the connections between these mythological stories and how they construct us as human beings and how they shape us culturally in our imaginations. And if you get to the end of the book and think, oh God, it's so dark, the question is, what next? And there's a jumping off point for the reader to take that on, rather than just saying, happily ever after, then she got married. We all know that's not a happily ever after.
Do you think about your characters after your book's ended?
I do because in my head they are somewhere there in a kind of little world that I've made for them, which is still spinning up there somewhere. They're still living those lives in that place. I'm not going to watch them anymore or write about them again, but I do feel they are there because they were very real to me in the years that I wrote the book and in the years that I lived with them for, as you know, you say, immersed in their world. So they never go away, of course.
Niraj has got a microphone and he is going to come and give it to anybody who'd like to ask a question, the lady in red.
I wanted to ask Anuradha, in calling the young man Mishkin, were you referencing Dostoevsky, or was that complete coincidence?
No, it was. It in the book, he is called Mishkin by his grandfather. And he says, you know, Mishkin is the prince in The Idiot. And so the boy is a bit indignant in the book and says, why do you call me after an idiot? And the grandfather says that idiots are the people who make humankind human. So it is really, it's definitely a conscious
It's a beautiful choice.
Yeah.
Another hand. I'm sure we have more questions from the floor. That is extraordinary. Well, that's fine, because here we go.
Both your books are fascinating. I just wanted to ask Anuradha something. You know, many writers or filmmakers or whatever have another discipline that informs their writing. Mm-hmm. It sounded like you were influenced by poetry. Or is there something else that really influenced the way you approach writing? And then the same question to Preti.
Thank you. I think what influences my writing, the whole of it, is my pottery, because I make pots. And I've been making pots for 30 years now. Not that I make very good pots. I somehow seem not to get beyond a certain point. But the idea that you begin with this ball, not even a ball. At first you start with sludge. The clay is sludge in a bucket. The hard work is to transform it into a malleable ball, which is your material. And then you put it on the wheel and you try to make a shape. And in the days when you are learning just to center that clay on the wheel and just to pull it up into a straight-sided, simple form, you have to become so used to failure, to discarding what you see as you think it is perfect. Your teacher comes and says, just throw it out because it's pretty bad. So over the years, going through this process, and then after you put it in the kiln and it emerges transformed in ways you had not anticipated, because you can never tell what is happening inside the kiln. Up to a point you've planned it, but what emerges is unplanned in some senses. There may be good and bad surprises. So that has really helped me to look at writing in a completely different way and to be able to also have the kind of, just the perseverance, just the tough-skinnedness to take years of being told or reading things and the next day and saying, this is really rubbish. Why did I think yesterday that it was so good?
I think for me, it's really two things. First of all, I've done a lot of work in charities and activism in different parts of the world, but a lot in the UK as well. And that's really very much, the people I've met on those trips and doing that work has really informed the way I think about society, and that goes into my work. And secondly, reading poetry, and particularly modernist, read English literature and Indian literature. That sense of structural formality, which I think that they really encapsulated, has really influences the way that I write.
We had another question there, yeah.
It's from my own experience. I was in India, came to England for the first time, and then for weeks there was no sun. And for the first time, I understood really the real meaning for the song of the song "Here Comes the Sun" by Beatles, which we had hummed, throughout our college days in India, but didn't understand. Similarly, you would understand "Zindagi Dhoop Tum Ghana Chhaya" is a kind of a line from a song. These are two very different metaphors. And unless you experience the culture or the place or physical geography, physical setting, it's very difficult to possibly imbibe its true meaning. How do we resolve that? I can understand chal and parts of the words which are used from a different language. You needn't use a glossary, but do authors attempt to possibly eliminate the cultural context of those metaphors while you're writing? Or is there a way of resolving this problem?
Well, Georgina, I didn't answer the part of your question, which was who are you writing for? And I think it's related. When I think about the short stories of someone like Manto, he didn't need to explain that. The idea of who is the reader, I think that stops one. I don't know whether you agree with that or
I
not.
feel that every reader takes home a different book.
Right.
And we read books from so many different cultures. When I'm reading a Colombian novel or something from France, I know I won't get every single layer that a French or Colombian reader will get. But I will have my own experience of that book, and that is the book for me.
Yeah.
So the books change and live so many different lives all over according to who is reading them.
Yeah, fiction is a strange country,
Yeah.
and it's a country of its own. It doesn't really have to, it's near our world, but it isn't this actual world. So I think we can get away with not over-explaining or undercooking.
Yeah.
There was a question here, yeah. Just hang on for the microphone, it's just coming over to you. And I think that's going to have to be our last one, actually.
It's so
I
delightful
think
to
they
hear
start
you.
playing the music.
It's so delightful to hear you. What was going through my mind is that both writers entertain or harbour a certain sadness, and I detect that from the tonal quality of the voice. In your writing journey, what were the low points and what were the heartaches?
Gosh, that's a big question.
Apart from the publication journey, which is a separate story, the writing of a character who perpetrates violence on another character, the writing of poverty, when you want to get it right without appropriating other people's lives. Even the way a father can tell a daughter that he's ashamed of her or disappointed in her, those are really difficult things because if you've experienced those things in any way, to actually get them out of your head and your heart and your body onto the page requires you to have a certain distance from them. So it takes drafts, and putting yourself through that again and again is also very, very difficult. I think.
But I think I wouldn't write unless it was actually something that makes me feel it's like a secret world you have inside you. It's there for you all the time. It's a flame that's inside you that nobody else can see. And that charges me up and takes me. You're absolutely right to say that writing these difficult parts where something bad or sad is happening to a character you've so lovingly built up, those are difficult. And the days when you can't get a word on the page are difficult. And when you have to delete a whole draft, it's difficult. But through it all, there's this absolute joy at making that book. And that's what keeps me going.
And we get absolute joy from reading them. Both of you, thank you so much.